Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Laura Sewell. I'm a vice president of LESPI, Lower East Side Preservation Organization. And I'm here with Richard Moses, our president, and Eve Kahn, who is a curator of a really remarkable exhibition at the Grolier Club. Eve reached out to LESPI because she saw our program on Rose Pastor Stokes last year, which is my cue to remind everyone of all the wonderful videos you can find on LESPI's YouTube channel. They're on our website, or you could just Google LESPI YouTube. That's what I usually do if you missed that one, and many of the other wonderful programs we have there. So Eve reached out to me after that and said, this is how I came to have lunch with Eve, who's a member of a rather esoteric club on the Upper East Side, who then proceeded to blow my mind with her knowledge of Zoe Anderson Norris, who lived 4 blocks from my apartment around the turn of the century and did remarkable work, both at telling her own personal story. She'd be a blogger if she were alive today, and her work with the poor. She very much worked outside of the system in her own way, doing her own thing, all of which are incredible. And we're going to hear all about that from Eve Kahn, who's practically she's with you. She's like practically in your body with you. You're so intimate with her work. So we're very much looking forward to hearing more about this. And we'll have some information on the exhibit, which is still up, and we really encourage you to go see it yourself. It's wonderful. We'll hold questions till the end, but you feel free to put them in the Q&A as they pop up, and we'll do our best to get to them later. Thank you very much, and take it away, Eve.
Well, can we just have the quick poll?
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot the poll.
Yeah, don't forget.
We'd like to start by asking where you're from, and the poll will pop up, and you'll just let us know if you're someone who lives in New York City right now or outside the Lower East Side. And we like to know like just who we're talking to here and who's joining us. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk for half an hour-ish about what brought Zoe Anderson Norris from rural Kentucky to rule Bohemia on the Lower East Side and to fight for the poor with her pen. I am so grateful for this invitation to the whole LESPI team. It's an honor to speak for a group that has done so much to preserve that neighborhood's physical, cultural legacy. And then I'm going to give a little dessert, which is that thanks to places like LESPI, an amazing number of the buildings where Zoe lived and worked and partied survive. So I'm going to show I'll give you a quick slideshow after I've told you a little bit more about the twists and turns of fate of her life. So she was the 13th. Oh, and I need to warn you of one thing. I have a black cat named Cleopatra, and she loves Zoom. So if you see a huge cat, she's normal size. Okay, so Zoe was the 13th of 15 children of Henry and Henrietta Anderson. She was born in 1860 in a small town just outside of Lexington called Harrodsburg. Her father had converted as a young man to the Disciples of Christ, one of the evangelical faiths that was sweeping the South. By the time Zoe was born, the 13th of 15 children in 1860, he was focusing on translating the New Testament again from ancient Greek through the lens of the Disciples of Christ, making minor variations on previous English translations. The book was considered a scholarly achievement. It still is. It remains in print. He published multiple editions of it, but he made very little money off of it. There was a flood of cheap Bibles produced right after the Civil War, and he couldn't compete. He had no major institution or congregation backing him. Henrietta was very well educated. Henry was extraordinarily well educated, not only fluent in ancient Greek, but also in Hebrew and Latin. And that level of erudition before the Civil War was only made possible because enslaved Black people did most of the hard work around Zoe's family's homes. In the book I'm writing on Zoe, there will be a page along these lines. I am excavating as many names as I can find of the people enslaved by her family in Virginia, Missouri, and Kentucky. Without their labor, Henry and Henrietta would not have had their extraordinary level of education. Zoe would not have had a cultured upbringing. My lectures, my exhibition, my writings on Zoe, in a sense, would not have been possible without these people's labor. I will be giving a tribute to them along these lines in my book. She was born at the outskirts of Harrodsburg. At lower left, that's either the farmhouse or a farmhouse near where she was born. She never stopped writing about velvety, gorgeous bluegrass country in Kentucky. Around 1870, when her father was in failing health, the family spent a few years living in Virginia down the road from this plantation. That's the plantation where Stonewall Jackson had died during the Civil War after being mortally wounded by accident by his own men. Zoe would have known during the war that she had two brothers fighting for the federal forces and first cousins fighting for the Confederacy. Kentucky was a bitterly divided border state. She would have known she had relatives shooting at each other, and she would have grown up around fresh scars of Civil War battlefields in Kentucky and then Virginia. She wrote about veterans over the years who were traumatized and trying to maximize their pensions from the US government. These are a few of her 14 siblings and their spouses. To tell you and any salient facts about them would take up the rest of our time here. Suffice it to say that a number of her siblings and their spouses became portrait painters and photographers. It was a creative family bent on documenting the world, but only Zoe took up her father's mantle of using writing, using her pen with which to document the world. In the mid-1870s, after her father's death in 1872, she was sent to an elite girls' boarding school in Harrodsburg, Daughters College, it was called. The building that it was in survives. It's a luxury hotel, and it's full of memorabilia from when it served as a girls' school. The head of the school firmly told his students, do not marry until you have developed enough professional skill as a teacher or perhaps a stenographer that you can support your family if the male breadwinners that you're counting on fail you. But Zoe didn't listen to him. She married in 1878 at age 18, days after graduation, like an idiot. And I'm quoting a memoir essay that she wrote a few months before her death in 1914. She married Spencer Norris. He'd grown up in Harrodsburg. She would have known him from her childhood. He was the only surviving son of a woman who'd been widowed young. And according to all accounts, he was brutally handsome. And according to Zoe's account, he was incredibly spoiled by his mother. In the late 1880s, he brings Zoe and their two children. They have a son named Rob and a daughter named Clarence. He brings the family to Wichita, Kansas, which is booming, and he runs grocery stores there. Around that same time, Zoe's widowed mother, Henrietta, and a couple of Zoe's siblings go to homestead at the Kansas frontier. And they would have lived in a dugout like this, top right, literally a hole in the ground with an entryway made out of sod and mud. There were no building materials. There were very few trees. There were no building materials until the railroad came through. Two of Zoe's brothers die young there, and her mother begins to go mad there. And Zoe never stopped writing about the terrors of homesteading at the Kansas frontier on land besieged by droughts, cyclones, locusts, and isolation. A number of her fictional characters over the years are terrified that the wind will get into their brain and addle it. On the left, that's her son, Rob, and of the pair of the girls on the right, that's her daughter, Clarence, on the right. These photos were taken around 1898 when Zoe and Spencer got divorced. He had been cheating on her for years, and he admitted as much in court. So by 1898, she's been experimenting with fiction and journalism, including a vicious, hilarious gossip column for a Wichita newspaper, and with the divorce that the flow of words becomes a fire hose, and it doesn't end until days before her death in 1914. She flees Wichita with the divorce. She leaves her son behind. He works for various railroads over the years, and she takes her daughter with her, takes Clarence on the road. She returns to Wichita perhaps once again. She needs this fire hose of words because Spencer's grocery store conveniently goes bankrupt right after the divorce, got alimony, but didn't got it, is how she put it in a memoir essay just before her death. These are illustrations from some of her first works published in national publications. On the left, that's an image from a short story she wrote. It's an author photo that appeared with a story she wrote about a Kansas frontier family whose daughter is killed by a tree bough felled in a cyclone. The center image of Zoe appeared with a travelogue she wrote about being in Colorado and staying at a hotel, and while on the veranda, overhearing a man dismiss Southerners like her as lazy. And to prove him wrong, she climbed Pikes Peak wearing thin slippers and then brought her torn up slippers back down to show everybody what she had done. And on the right, that's an image from a short story she wrote about a woman living in Kansas who hates her mother-in-law back in the South and is dutifully writing a letter inviting her mother-in-law to stay with them in Kansas, but never sends the letter, tears it up. This is apparently based on Zoe's bad relationship with Spencer's mother. In 1899 and 1900, Zoe and Clarence travel widely in Europe, and Zoe sends home a fire hose about American women traveling alone, flirting with men on steamships, meeting Europeans who've already met people from Kentucky like them. She writes an article about the World's Fair in Paris in 1900 and takes photographs of it. On the fairgrounds, her daughter Clarence meets a handsome Brit who's billed as a fabulously wealthy silk tycoon. His name is Harold Morris, but he turns out to be a deadbeat gambler and an adulterer. But just as Zoe had married disastrously as a teenager, Clarence proceeds to marry disastrously as a teenager. Clarence ends up stuck in Europe for years with her little son, Robert Morris, trying to get out of Harold's clutches. By 1901, Zoe has settled in New York, and she basically never leaves again. And the fire hose of words, in her fiction, she often portrays heroines who are freelance writers struggling, just as she did. On the left, that's an image from a short story she wrote about a woman who has deformed her thumb. She has typed so many manuscripts for periodicals that have been rejected. And on the right, that's an image from a short story she wrote about a woman writer who's more successful than her boyfriend, who's also trying to make a living as a writer, and he storms out in a fit of jealousy. On the left, that story ends with a suitable suitor rescuing that freelance writer from a life of poverty. About 2/3 of Zoe's stories about love and happily give us something cheerful, the editors would insist, and she tried to comply. In 1902, she reaches her first peak of literary fame. She's living in Harlem. She's living on East 126th Street by then. And she writes a novel, The Color of His Soul, about a hypocritical socialist orator named Cecil Mallon, who preaches sympathy for the wage slaves of the world, particularly on the Lower East Side. But he's a hypocrite. He has a teenage mistress who's a seamstress, and when she gets pregnant, he abandons her and she dies in childbirth. He is unmasked as a predator and a cad by a neighbor of his in Harlem, a journalist from the South named Dolly. The novel debuts to rave reviews, and days later, an actual hypocritical, womanizing socialist orator that Zoe knows, named Courtney Lemon, surfaces and says, "I'm obviously the role model for this terrible Cecil Mallon. I never did such terrible things." He threatens legal action, and Funk and Wagnalls pulls the book. Zoe eventually republishes it with a less prestigious publishing house. I have both editions in my Grolier show. The Funk and Wagnalls edition is incredibly rare because I think the company pulped all the remaining inventory after the lawsuit was threatened. Threat to pretty girl novelist was one of the headlines during the legal wranglings. She's 42 and a grandmother when she gets called a pretty girl. I suspect it bothered her less than you might think. By 1902, she shaved about 7 years off of her age on legal documents even. And by the end of her life, she shaves a full 10 years off of her age. And when someone a historian interviews her and publishes something close to her real age, she calls him a chronological fiend stealing her youth. You can see that there's a tiny initials, a JKB, under the silhouettes on the cover and the title page of the book. That stands for John Kennedy Bryan's, Jack Bryan's. In 1902, he becomes Zoe's second husband. He is a prolific silhouette artist for newspaper comics, magazines. He illustrates the cover of her second book, The Quest to Polylock, based on her own travels in Europe. The Quest to Polylock also focuses on how much desperate poverty Zoe saw, disabled beggars thronging her, particularly in Italy. Jack Bryans also illustrates a book for James Carruthers, who's a Black pastor and author that's a friend of his and Zoe's. Zoe and Jack's marriage seems to have soured quickly. Zoe begins to write in her fiction and journalism about how boring it is to sit around and watch a comic artist grind out fun and try to be funny. And also she writes about creative, successful women who are drained by their less creative, less successful newspapermen husbands. I can't find any evidence that they actually divorced, but they were separated within a year or so of the marriage. Also within a year or so, Clarence, her daughter, and her grandson, Robert Morris, managed to get out of London, where they've been trapped by Harold Morris, and they move in with Zoe. Jack refuses to live with them, and Zoe kicks out Jack instead. 1905, 1906, she supports her family with a fire hose of words, particularly for newspapers. She walks the perimeter of Manhattan for the New York Times, and she reports on haunting details like little kids at the waterfront on the west side and the east side, gathering kindling wood so that they could help their families heat their homes in the winter. And one of these little kids, she writes, perhaps senses that she was a freelancer, and he offers her some kindling just in case she needed some help also getting her home warm in the winter. She writes about a horse cart lying on its back with its empty arms imploring the heavens. She notices everything along the waterfront. For the New York Sun, she interviews zoo animals. And the tortoise complains that everybody keeps asking his wife how old she is. And the hippopotamus complains that every time I open my mouth, I make a sensation and I get all this unwanted public attention. And she sympathizes with the hippo because as a female journalist, she tells him she's also sometimes opened her mouth and gotten a lot of unwanted public attention for it. Also for the New York Sun, she writes a series of short stories that she gathers into her third book, 12 Kentucky Colonel stories. They're based on feuds that broke out among her relatives and neighbors in Kentucky. Some of them are based on real stories that I can trace in newspapers, and some of them are obviously made up. One feud breaks out because one man's mother-in-law is injured in a gunfight, and there's bitter generations of men killing each other in broad daylight. And in the end of the story, you realize that the reason the fight was so bitter was that that man hated his mother-in-law and wanted her killed instead of simply injured. 1907, 1908, she's venturing ever deeper into immigrant neighborhoods in Harlem and on the Lower East Side. And her heart breaks to see the little mothers, the little fathers who are 6, 8, 10-year-olds who are home alone with their smaller siblings while the parents are out working, mostly in sweatshops. Zoe also marvels at the resourcefulness of the poor, that they're turning a doorway, a stairwell, into a thriving pickle stand, for example. By 1907, 1908, her daughter Clarence at lower left and the little boy on the right side, that's her grandson, Robert Morris. Clarence remarries and moves back to Harrodsburg, and Zoe is left alone. She had loved living with them. She called them Madonna con Bambino. The Bam is the little boy's nickname. And when they leave her, she's bereft. And at some point she has a breakdown and she ends up in a charity hospital, and she's convinced that the staff would kill her, except they realized she was a famous writer. In 1909, she pulls herself together. She pawns her remaining jewelry and she founds her own magazine. She is tired of being told what to do by men by then. By then, she's been plagiarized by male editors, harassed, stiffed on fees, accused of all kinds of misdeeds. She founds her own bi-monthly magazine from spring of 1909, and she issues the last issue comes out days before her death in February 1914. She writes virtually every word. She gives herself all the masthead titles, including hod carrier, bricklayer, bootblack, circulation liar, printer's devil, the whole cheese, and the whole shebang. She's living by then at 338 East 15th Street. She's on the 7th floor with a south-facing window, and she sees desperate immigrant poverty stretching all the way south, practically to City Hall. And this is her brochure. She gets blurbs, for example, from Elbert Hubbard, the great tastemaker and philosopher in Western New York, and also David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford. She explains that she gets ideas just by looking out her window. At the court of 100 living windows, she sees abusive fathers and husbands in action. She sees little kids dangling from the fire escapes, trying to help their parents wash the windows. She sees the telephone line man shimmying up the pole, handing out wires along the way, risking his life. She finds an illustrator named William Oberhart who's willing to work for her for free. She starts to review theater shows because he loves to go to plays and musicals, and she pays him in the form of sharing her press passes to theater. She doesn't actually enjoy reviewing theater. She literally writes, you know, such and such an actor did a good job. You know, he's on his fourth wife. She really just wants to gossip about theater people. And William Oberhart follows her around, and they go out to Ellis Island and they explore all the slums. They interview a rabbi, and she interviews him, and William Oberhart illustrates him. She loves skyscrapers. She loves the windows that flash back the fire of the sun. She's upset when some of her favorite market stalls are swept away by development. They get into synagogues. This is the synagogue at 60 Rivington Street. It has 2 women's galleries. That's the only synagogue that can be. I have no idea how a man got into the synagogue, into the women's gallery during services. It's possible Zoe, who had some art training, did the original sketch, and then William Oberhart turned it into the final magazine cover. In the course of this magazine, she gets angrier and angrier at how government and charities treat the poor. She's enraged to see little kids, women tottering under enormous burdens on the streets, men trudging through toxic muck in factories. She interviews the families of the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, who've been stiffed on money that charities had promised them. Literally, charities are telling them, well, we wanted to help you after your teenage breadwinner was killed in this horrific tragedy, but you didn't sign the right forms right away. And Zoe is raging about this incompetence. She's writing about women peddlers trying to fend off men, trying to usurp their little corner on the curb. She writes about herself, her beauty treatments, her bad marriages, her life in Kansas, Kentucky. She wraps herself in flowered and checked shawls and goes out on the streets and plays the accordion and begs. She pretends to be an immigrant musician, and she makes $1.50 in change, which is more than she makes as a magazine publisher, she explains. She watches and takes notes on rich philanthropists blithely walking past her and other beggars giving her money. One of the few songs she can play on the accordion, however, is My Old Kentucky Home. So I suspect she did not make a terribly persuasive immigrant musician. Lower left, that's an image that appeared with a newspaper profile of her that was syndicated widely. She becomes renowned nationally as one of the few women to live in the slums by choice and to document it. And you can just make out over her typewriter in that tiny sketch, it says, "This is my busy day." There's a little sign. She loved to write about typing even. The Song of the Typewriter is one of her best poems. The refrain is, "Now work, damn you, work." There are dozens of other magazines in a similar format to hers. It's about 4 by 6 inches. Most of them are run by men. The one woman I can find running one of these is Emma Goldman, who the rabble rouser, who's got Mother Earth that's being published during Zoe's time, right near Zoe on East 13th Street. But Emma Goldman publishes contributions by multiple authors, and Zoe writes virtually every word herself. Some of these men publishing these magazines, she was friends with. Others of them she got in spats with. So they would trash her in their Jan-Feb 1910 issue, and she would trash them back in her July-August 1910 issue. It was kind of like bloggers, but with a long time lapse in between. They all charge about the same rate for a subscription, $1 a year. For $10, you could be a lifetime subscriber to Zoe's magazine, and you'd get listed as a life preserver alongside her masthead. My favorite of her ever-changing masthead titles is this: "If you want to see what she is, start something." She doesn't want to be pigeonholed as a shrill reformer, and she wants to draw more people into her cause and attract more subscribers. So every Wednesday or Thursday night at a different restaurant, mostly on the Lower East Side, she has a blowout dinner party, 98 cents a head, for the Ragged Edge Club with a K, dedicated to the killing of care with a K and comfortable exclusiveness, all with Ks. I believe that Zoe in the foreground with that starburst brooch on her hat. That room would have been full of other creative types, writers, artists, performers. She also attracted physicians, lawyers, reformers, politicians would come down and give talks to the Ragged Edge Club, trying to win them over to various causes, laws that needed to be changed, reforms that needed to be instituted. Many of her friends that she writes about in her magazine, and I go to research them further, I realize that's not their real name, that they have come to New York and adopted a fake name, a fake identity, because they're on the run from a scandal in their hometown, or they've ennobled themselves. They're calling them von something that they don't deserve, or Baroness to something. She sends out weekly invitations, and anybody who's planned public programs knows what a hassle that must have been bureaucratically. The Ragged Edgers dance like dervishes, including between courses, and a regular musician for them was a Black ragtime pianist and composer named Harry Huggs. And I found some of his music copyrighted at the Library of Congress, including this one with this gorgeous Art Nouveau cover. This is a fraction of my collection of other sheet music composed or performed by friends of Zoe's. You see there's a recurring image of a woman with great hats, great hair. That's Libby Blondell. She was a vaudeville star. She was a friend of Zoe's. It's a fake name. Bluestein was her first husband's real last name. And sometimes Libby put an E at the end of her last name, and sometimes she didn't. It depended on her whim. And at the bottom, you can see there's choreography for a Golden Grain dance published by Louis Shalif. He was the dance master of the Ragged Edgers. They adopted all the latest moves, including the airship quadrille and the banana peel slide. The banana peel slide required a yellow gown with a high slit and white tights underneath. These are some of the restaurants where the Ragged Edgers dined. Cafe Boulevard on Lower 2nd Avenue, that was where the 2nd Avenue Deli eventually was. Little Hungary was on East Houston around Avenue A. Joel's Bohemia was near Times Square. They went out to Brighton Beach, Coney Island during the summers. Joel's Bohemia had pictures of the regulars on the wall. And when you blow up that one image to the maximum magnification, you can see that it says Zoe Norris. She's wearing a great feathered hat. She was on the wall at this restaurant, Joel's Bohemia. That's the kind of fixture she was of New York nightlife. I also collect cutlery and glassware and china from the restaurants where the Ragged Edgers dine, because there's nothing that makes you feel more vividly that you're in the room with the spirit of the person that you're writing, exhibiting, and lecturing on than holding a pickle fork from a restaurant where you know they dined. I've also snuck into this image a bottle of bourbon made by one of her relatives in Kentucky. The only restaurant that survives from the Ragged Edgers' time that's still in use is Keen's Chop House. We're going to go have a Ragged Edge reunion there in a few weeks. She becomes nationally known for running the Ragged Edge Club, and she gets dubbed the Queen of Bohemia. And at first she hates that title. Bohemia in her time suggested a place where people pretentiously quoted from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. They were willing to live in filth, and they indulged all their worst impulses. So a man in Bohemia felt perfectly entitled, for example, to run off with his latest affinity, as lovers were euphemistically called, leaving their families starving and freezing. But eventually she gets called it so often she just decides to claim it. And she begins to hand out aristocratic titles to the Ragged Edgers with a long Hungarian wine bottle as a scepter, and thus is anointed, for example, Lady Betty Rogers of the Bronx and Baron Bernhardt of Hoboken. Also in the 1910s, she publishes her last novel, The Way of the Wind. It's based on her own family's disastrous experiences, homesteading in Kansas, descending into poverty and madness. It was praised for its Thomas Hardy relentlessness, but not many copies sold. The copies I've ever seen all are inscribed by Zoe, and many of them are inscribed to friends of hers or to relatives of hers. In the Jan-Feb issue of 1914 of the East Side, she describes her vivid recent dream that she's going to die soon, that her mother, Henrietta, who had died in 1897, had come to her literary sanctum on East 15th Street, her apartment, and warned, "You're the next of my many children to die." Zoe writes that she shrieked at this warning and then grew relieved. She writes, at least, if this dream comes true, I've been given some time to prepare, and I hope I've done some good for the world by fighting for the poor with my pen. She mails out the issue as it lands in subscribers' mailboxes. She goes to a Ragged Edge dinner at Cafe Boulevard on Lower 2nd Avenue. She collapses. She's brought to a charity hospital across the avenue, and she dies. And these are some of the cards left by ragged edgers at her funeral. This was left by a cigar dealer named Jack McPike, the Prince of McPike, she called him. This is Libby Blondell, her vaudevillian friend. And on the day she had that business card printed, calling card printed, she put an E at the end of her last name. Down here, you see Mrs. Lathrop Colgate Harper, Mabel Herbert Erner. Mabel was a novelist and a newspaper columnist. Her husband, Lathrop Harper, was a book dealer, and from that fabulously wealthy Harper Publishing family, and he was a Grolier Club member. And so I can tell you that I've got an example of Mabel's writings and an image of Mabel hanging in a room in a gallery where I know that Mabel and Lathrop stood. So those are the freaky interweavings that happen when you go this far down a research rabbit hole. The news that the Queen of Bohemia had predicted her own death made headlines in hundreds of newspapers nationwide. She wanted to be buried in New York. She wanted the hearse and the Ragged Edger procession to go through the streets of the Lower East Side, but her family had her buried in Harrodsburg in the family plot. And I have no idea who's marveled over the years that there's a gravestone that looks otherwise ordinary that was erected by the Ragged Edge Club of New York. And you'll notice that her gravestone has her death date on it, but not her birth year. Somebody was trying to protect the secret of her real age, even in the afterlife. So her legacy. On the left, that's her grandson, Robert Morris, the Bambino, as she called him. He joins the Navy. He becomes an admiral. He's a war hero during World War II. Her daughter, Clarence, marries a seed company owner named Fletcher Chelf. And years after Zoe's death, the Fletcher and Clarence have a daughter named Mary, and Mary becomes a prominent singer and educator. She ends up retiring to Harrodsburg, and she founds the Ragged Edge Theater on the main drag in honor of the grandmother she never knew, and the theater thrives to this day. This is a fraction of my collection of the magazines that she was published in. She had no will. She had no possessions of value. She just bequeathed us all a great story. This is a fraction of my collection. You'll see it on view at the Grolier Club, and it's full of illustrations by some of the great Golden Age illustrators. And one last slide, and then I'm going to give you the dessert of the images of her haunts on the Lower East Side. On the left, that's a lithograph stone for with a portrait of Zoe that ran in a 1913 issue of the East Side. I tracked down her illustrator, William Oberhart's family. He went on to fame for designing, for example, the first covers of Time magazine. And they had a massive archive. They live in rural Maryland, and the whole attic was full. And they were persuaded to donate everything to New York Historical Society. But New York Historical wouldn't take the lithograph stones. They're beastly heavy. They weigh 60, 80 pounds. But I had to have that stone. I had to get that back to New York, where Zoe felt most at home. So the family put it in 3 tote bags for me, and it tore through all 3 tote bags on the Amtrak ride home. I had to have it. And on the right, that's me in front of her building. It says lost in graffiti on the door, but that was taken a few years ago, and that graffiti is gone because she's not lost anymore. She's found. And I'm holding up a cheap reprint of the East Side, and the left-hand page is the song of the typewriter with the refrain, "Now work, damn you work." And on the right side is an image of Zoe dressed as an immigrant playing the accordion on the streets of the Lower East Side and playing, of all things, My Old Kentucky Home. So I'm going to switch out here really quickly to my slideshow. Can everyone see that? Thumbs up? Thumbs up on that? Yes, good. Okay. So a few of the buildings that where Zoe lived and worked over the years.
We're sorry, we're still on the last page.
Oh, so how do I start sharing? Is that coming up yet? New share? How about that?
You might have to unshare, and
There you
then
go.
yeah,
There
now
you
we
go.
got it.
Was that's up? Okay, great. All right, thank you. Okay, so a few buildings, an amazing percentage of the buildings where she lived and worked and parties survive, thanks to organizations like LESPI. Around 1905, 1906, she lived near the Flatiron Building, and multiple of the buildings in this in a sort of canyon-like area survive. There was, I fake my way into these buildings where she lived by pretending to be renting apartments for my niece who's moving to New York. My niece has moved to New York, and it's not, and Zoe would approve of this kind of subterfuge, because I have to climb the stairs that she climbed while worrying about how much she was going to have to type to pay the rent. there was a psychic in one of these buildings, and I didn't go the first time I saw that psychic's office, and by the time I built up the nerve to go to the psychic's office, the psychic was gone. I was going to ask if there was any sense of the spirit of Zoe in that building. So she lived on East 15th at 338, and it's the same entrance goes to 338 and 340 East 15th. And she looked south before, obviously before this modern building. Her view south into desperate immigrant poverty is now blocked by the building on the north side of 14th. This is a tax photo from the 1940s of the building. It looks amazingly like this still. I snuck into it again, pretending to be renting apartments for my niece, and the floor tiles remain from Zoe's time, and the stairwell that I can trail up and wonder how she felt going up those stairs, worrying about paying the rent, is still there. I was able to get to a side of the building from which you can kind of make out the view that she would have had into her court of 100 living windows and the skyscrapers she would have seen at the horizon. That's me channeling Zoe, standing at one of the windows, looking into a version of the court of 100 living windows. This is how William Oberhardt sketched the view from her window in her time. And I snuck up to the door of the apartment she would have had. And I think she would actually have enjoyed that welcome mat. She was quite feisty and unfiltered, and she grew feistier and more unfiltered with time. This building on the east side of 2nd around 15th Street survives. It's a school now, and it was a charity in Zoe's time dedicated to the Little Mothers Aid Society. There was an entire foundation in her time that she thought was incompetent that helped the 8, 10, 12-year-old girls who were stuck at home taking care of their infant and toddler siblings while their parents were at sweatshops. I know that she went to multiple buildings on Rivington Street that were used by charities that were either low cost or free housing that were run by settlement houses. That's one of them. I know she got into this synagogue, and you see me standing helplessly outside. I'm still trying to persuade the owner to let me in to 60 Rivington Street with the 2 women's galleries. I know that both of these buildings on Rivington Street were run by settlement houses, and that they offered housing as well as classrooms. I know that she was there documenting the conditions, interviewing, observing classrooms, for example. I know she went down to Chinatown, and 2 of the buildings that she specifically mentions the address of where she dined. She wanted to interview Chinese women who were out dining alone, like the high society women of the Upper East Side, but she couldn't find any. And the men told her that no respectable Chinese immigrant wife would have been seen. This place, though, I highly recommend, 24 Pell Street. And yes, again, channeling Zoe's spirit. I know that she interviewed the families of the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. I know she was right here. On Saturday morning before the rain struck, I went out and with a whole group of people that go out and chalk on the sidewalks in front of the homes of these girls on the anniversary of the fire, March 25th. I know that Zoe was here interviewing Bertha Wendroff's family. And I know that Zoe was also on Pike Street. That was on Henry. This is on Pike Street. I know she was right here interviewing Anna Altman's family. We put up posters and we chalked, there were 146 sites that needed to be commemorated. This is the site of where her favorite restaurant, Little Hungary, was on East Houston around Avenue A. The building has vanished, but there's witness buildings just down the block. I know that this was a restaurant called Coraccioni and Kmetz in her time where she partied. They were, the owners were subscribers to her magazine. I know that this was a restaurant called Pokol, which means hell in Hungarian in her time at 69 2nd Avenue. The grocery store owner was completely perplexed as to why anyone would be photographing a tin ceiling. And I didn't have the time or the heart to try and explain to him that the ragged edgers had been there under that tin ceiling. This was a restaurant run by a friend of hers named Alexander Bolog. She quotes him at length. She suspects he was royalty in the old country, she writes. And this is where the Cafe Boulevard, which then became Cafe Bohème, which was then torn down, which then became the 2nd Avenue Deli. I know that on this site is where she attended one last Ragged Edge dinner. I know that at 203 2nd Avenue, just across the avenue, I know this is the People's Hospital where she was brought after she collapsed at dinner. I know this was where she died. And I know this was the People's Hospital. The Ukrainian group that runs it has researched its history, and they loved to tell me about it. And it still says People's Hospital in the tiles in the foyer. So I know that her funeral was held at a building run by a German-American, John Leppig. He was the mayor of Avenue A, and his headquarters, which had a meeting place and a bowling alley and a saloon, was 101 Avenue A. Why is that important? Because that's an LGBTQ and otherwise cultural landmark. That's where the Pyramid Club was in the 1980s. I think Zoe would love the fact that a great drag punk, no holds barred nightclub was in the building where her funeral was held and full of ragged edgers. The research gods keep shining on me, and I happened to walk past 101 Avenue A. I happened to see it under renovation. I happened to get a good shot of this plaque, tribute to, it's got quotes from a Teddy Roosevelt speech. It's a Roosevelt plaque. Somebody needs to alert the owner that needs to be preserved. And just a few more images. I know she walked the perimeter of Manhattan, including along the Lower East Side. This is from her New York Times series. I know that she saw little kids gathering up and handing out kindling wood along the shores. And I know she was at the western end of the island also, right? That's the familiar ferry terminal there. And one last slide. I know this is actually the West Village, so I apologize to those who focus on the East Village, but I know that she went to interview Mark Twain at his mansion on Fifth Avenue, on the west side of Fifth Avenue at 9th Street. I know that mansion doesn't survive. I know that he refused to come downstairs and talk to her. So what she did resourcefully instead was to interview his cat, Bambino. I know that Zoe spoke to this cat and told this cat that if he ever tired of sitting around cooped up all day with a humorist, he could come live with her, and she would take him to the top of the New York Times building and he could shimmy up the flagpole. She maintained a sense of humor, even while trying futilely to change the world. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing and really looking forward to any questions, comments anyone has. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, LESPI team. So fun to share this story.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. A really phenomenal presentation. We don't have any questions yet. We'll keep an eye on them and see if any pop up. You really brought Zoe's life to the forefront here, and really made it resonate with us. Both because her life was so, in a sense, modern. I think, not this kind of traditional view that you think of for that period, and also because you pointed out, where she lived, where she visited, where she partied, and you can really get a sense of her moving around the city, which is very exciting. And I think it also calls out a little bit again that we need to preserve these areas that and these buildings, so that people can still sort of get the sense of her life in a bricks and mortar, real kind of touchy-feely sense. And so I think that is, that's very important. That's what we're about at LESPI. And but thank you for bringing that forward for us, because just phenomenal. And we do have a question. Oh, now we have two. Joyce writes, where do you keep that heavy stone? It's great that you were able to keep it.
It lives in those tote bags, right? Those, I keep the tote bags because it's such a funny story. I keep the torn tote bags. It lives wrapped in towels in a corner of my office, but it's on view right now through May 13th at the Grolier Club, 10 to 5 weekdays and Saturdays. It's right next to the receptionist desk in the foyer, and I was terrified when, so fortunately my husband does kettlebells, so he was able to maneuver it around, and fortunately a member of the exhibitions team also does powerlifting, so they were able to get it on top of a pedestal, and I was terrified that the pedestal was going to collapse, but it seems to be okay now. Yeah.
So Thank you. And Jill writes, did you get a sense that she was very compelled and had a kind of joy in exploring the people and places of the Lower East Side?
Oh, absolutely. She writes about my beloved poor. And it's a strange, a single issue would be a strange mixture of humor and tragedy. You know, she would write about, she would rant about men who could escape paying alimony by simply going to the Ludlow Street jail. You know, take a vacation at the Ludlow Street jail for 6 months and not and then get out and not have to pay alimony after that. Or men who could simply move to New Jersey and evade paying alimony. And in that same issue, she writes a jokey story about a man named Anton who is in an attic. He's working as a rag picker. He's sifting through the rags, you know, to get the silks and velvets and, you know, the different kinds of fabric, the different colors of fabrics. He finds a gold purse full of gold coins mixed with the rags. He tells the old lady that he's working with that he's going out to lunch. He goes out, he invests all that money that he's made. He makes a fortune. Then he makes mistakes and he loses his fortune and he goes back to the attic. And the old lady says, of course, that was a long lunch. So this can't possibly be true. Yes, and she loved cities. She was attacked by one of the other small magazine owners for, you know, wanting to live in a place that was so unhealthful and dangerous. And she wrote back, the only thing I ever got from the countryside was poison ivy.
Oh. Well, Helena writes, no question. I just want to say that that was wonderful and great fun. And Suzanne asks, what sparked your initial interest?
Oh, thank you for asking. So the Grolier Club has a member named Steve Lamezzo, who is the world's great collector of American periodicals. He signs his emails, periodically yours. He has 83,000 at last count from some of the 1730s first mentions of free speech on through, for example, Madonna's first cover of Interview, 83,000. The Grolier Club had a field trip to his home in New Jersey in the fall of 2018. And in his 19th and 20th century room, he handed me a bound volume of Zoe's East Side and said, I've always been interested in her. There's no scholarship on her, but I've always been intrigued by her. And I start leafing through this magazine and I'm thinking, who is this woman who shows her own image again and again in her magazine, who has her own name written huge in spiky letters on the covers and that I've never heard of, and who is sympathetically portraying the struggles of my own Ukrainian-born, Yiddish-speaking grandmother and grandfather and their siblings who were on the same streets of the Lower East Side that Zoe was around that time, at a time when many publications demonized my ancestors. Who is this woman portraying them so sympathetically?
Betty writes, thank you, very interesting. Excuse me. Jill writes, how many years have you been working on this research? And what is your hope for this work moving forward?
So I started in fall of 2018. During COVID, I can't tell you how many hours a day I distractedly spent in front of my machine, researching her and every imaginable angle of her life, her friends' lives, and going on eBay and getting artifacts that shed light on her. So it's been about 5 years. My book manuscript is due in November it's under consideration by an academic press. And I hope to have the book out, could be as early as next year or the year after. And yeah, I own the only complete run of her magazine known to survive in private hands. And I only know of one other complete run, all 29 issues, and that's at City College. So I hope to find a good home for that and some of the other material that I've gathered.
Yeah, that's incredible. I just want to say thank you again. And it is, it's really amazing that we're still uncovering and discovering our history here on the Lower East Side. It's so rich and so has such depth. And I was been thinking about why we don't know of her. And it seems like we're very familiar with the work of the settlement house women. And we've done, LESPI's interested in some of the settlement houses as potential landmarks and has done a lot of research into the settlement house women. But Zoe worked so much outside the system and on her own terms and not associated with a building that is the first thing to attract, historical interest. So it's a really interesting story and a wonderful discovery, and we really can't thank you enough.
And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and right, she was like her father in a way, who had no congregation, no institution backing him, and yet had a vision of what she was supposed to be doing. Yeah, no, and she was still a devout Christian to the end of her days, but she didn't belong to any congregation even. She had one friend who was, he worked at Trinity Church downtown, and he was the night, he ran the services at night. So at 2:30 in the morning, there were so many people either going to work at dawn or pre-dawn in that time, either coming home from work at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., that they crowded the Trinity Church with they managed to pack in a full Episcopal congregation in the middle of the night.
Oh, well, thank you, Eve. And I want to remind everybody about Eve's exhibit at the Grow Your Club at 47 East 60th Street. You can see the photo on the screen. It is on the screen, isn't it?
Yes.
Oh, good. 47 East 60th Street. It runs through May 13th, open weekdays and Saturdays, and you can get more information at growyourclub.org. And I want to give the poll results. We did the poll earlier to see where everybody lives. So 30% of you actually live in the Lower East Side, which is a nice percentage, higher than we often get. Another 40% is in New York City, outside of the Lower East Side. 20% is in the tri-state area, including Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York, outside of New York City. And then 10% is outside of this tri-state area. So for those of you who missed some or all of tonight's presentation, we will be posting it on LESPI's YouTube channel, where we also have a lot of other webinars that we've given in the past that you might find interesting, all related to Lower East Side history and architecture. So recommend that you visit our site. If you join it, you'll get notifications when new webinar videos are posted, and there's a lot of interesting material there. Also, keep an eye open for future LESPI webinars. We give these periodically, including book talks and historical talks, the way similar to what we had tonight. And also make sure to mark your calendar. May 7th, which is a Sunday, will be our walking tour of the historic core of Chinatown as part of Lower East Side History Month. So we're very excited about that. It's our first live walking tour since before the pandemic. So it should be very nice. It's all outside, and by May, hopefully we'll be having some good warm weather. So also, if you want to keep up with what LESPI is doing, we do a lot of stuff. But today we met with the Landmarks Commission and met with our councilperson Christopher Marte about moving forward our landmark designation requests. For example, we do a lot of stuff with the community. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And finally, please consider making a donation to LESPI if you can. That these webinars do cost money to produce, and your donation would help us also with our advocacy work and our educational outreach. So you can find a donate button on your original invitation or on our website. You can see here the address on the slide, www.lespi-nyc.org. And I want to thank everyone for attending tonight, and please have a very good evening.
Thank you very much. Bye, all.
Thank you so much. Good night. Thank you so much. Great
Thank you.
fun. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Eve. Thank you. Bye-bye.